Do milk and dairy products such as cottage cheese or cream cheese require kashrut supervision?
This issue is thankfully not really an issue at all in Eretz Yisrael, because all of the milk is produced by Jews, but this is of course an issue, in theory at least, in other parts of the world. The Mishnah states in Masechet Avodah Zarah, Lamed He Amud Be 35b, the Mishnah states, Wa'elu devarim shel goyim, the following articles, items that are, if one buys them from non-Jews, asurim, they are asur. And one of these items mentioned in the Mishnah is halav shehalavo goy, wa'en Yisrael ro'ehu, milk that was milked by a non-Jew, and a Jew was not present at the time of the milking, was not able to witness what was going on. The problem, of course, is that the non-Jew may have added to the milk that he sold to the Jew, he may have added to the milk some milk from a non-kosher animal. The halakha, of course, is that anything which comes from a non-kosher source is also non-kosher. In other words, if an animal is not a kosher animal that we are not allowed to consume, for example a horse, then the milk of a horse is also forbidden from the Torah, just as the meat of the horse is forbidden. The same applies to any animal that we are not allowed to eat according to the Torah. So, in theory, a Jew could go to a non-Jew in the time of the Mishnah and say, I brought my bucket, please fill it up with milk from your cows or from your sheep or goats, and I want it filled up all the way to the top. And the non-Jew may have not quite enough milk to fill up the bucket all the way to the top, but he also has a couple of pigs or a horse or what have you, or a camel in his backyard and on his farm, and when he goes around the back of the house or to the area where he keeps these animals, when the Jew is not looking, he might top up the bucket with some milk from, shall we say, the horse or from the pig. And for this reason, this gezerah or this halakha was formulated, that it is asur, it is forbidden to consume milk that was milked by a non-Jew, unless a Jew was able to see exactly what was being milked and what the origin of this milk was. The Mishnah, another Mishnah, later in the same Masechet, on Daf Lamed Tet Amud Bet 39b, states, Wa'elu mutarim ba'achila, and the following items bought from non-Jews are permissible. Halav shehalavo roy u'Yisrael ro'ehu, milk that was milked by a non-Jew, and a Jew was able to witness the milking process. Now the Gemara goes on to explain that this is true even where the Jew did not necessarily see with absolute certainty and clarity, not see with his own eyes the milking process, but rather he would have been able to do so had he wanted to. The Gemara goes on to say as follows: we have learnt the following statement. Yoshev Yisrael b'sad idro shel goy, a Jew may sit, in other words, in the field next to the fence, beyond which the non-Jew has a pasture where he has different animals. If the Jew sits next to this flock that belongs to the non-Jew, and the non-Jew then goes and milks with the bucket that the Jew provided him, for example, and brings him the milk, the Jew does not have to be concerned. There's no issue, no halachic reason not to consume this milk. And the Gemara asks, well, isn't that obvious? If this person, this non-Jew, has nothing but animals that are permitted to Jews, such as sheep or cows in his field, then obviously there's no issue. He couldn't possibly add, you would think, he couldn't possibly add non-kosher milk to the milk. And if, on the other hand, this in his field he has both, shall we say, cows and horses, or camels, or pigs, then why would it be mutar if the Jew did not was not fully aware of what he was milking, what the milk was, which animal the milk was being taken from? The Gemara answers that we are talking about a situation that even if the Jew was, shall we say, sitting down next to the fence of the field where the non-Jew went off to do the milking, and if he's sitting down, he's not able to see exactly what the non-Jew is doing. He can't actually see with his own eyes if he's milking a cow or a horse, but if he were to stand up, he would be able to see this and know for a fact. The fact that he is able to do so, and the non-Jew knows that he is able to do so, this is sufficient reason, this is a sufficient proof that the non-Jew did not do so, because the non-Jew would not wish to get himself in trouble. He would want to lose business, because if the word got out, for example, that this non-Jew was trying to fool this Jew and add to the bucket of milk some milk from another source, from a non-kosher source, more than likely all the Jews in the area would get to know this, and they would cease coming to him to buy milk. And this, of course, would be a major blow for him economically, and therefore he would be definitely motivated not to do so, not to ruin his reputation with the local Jewish population. This is what the Gemara states in Avodah Zarah Daf Lamotet Amud Bet 39b. Now there are a couple of points that we need to clarify here. The first point is that it is very clear from the Mishnah and the Talmud on this issue that the entire reason for stating this halakha, that one has to witness the milking of the milk that one wishes to purchase from a non-Jew, the entire reason for this was the possibility, which was a real possibility based on the conditions that existed at that time. We're talking about, roughly 2,000 years ago. The very real possibility that the milk that you were being provided with was not entirely pure, that it had some admixture of other milk in it. In other words, horse milk or camel milk does not look or smell or taste the same as cow milk. And clearly you could not ask for cow milk and be given horse milk and not know the difference. But if, as I explained before, if the non-Jew was short, let's say 10% of the amount that you required, adding 10% horse milk to the cow milk may not be detectable. And this was the reason for the formulation of this halakha, as opposed to certain other things that were forbidden by Chazal. In other words, that we are not allowed to buy, according to the Mishnah, we're not allowed to purchase from non-Jews things such as bread or oil, which the Mishnah speaks of as well. These things were not forbidden because of the possibility of there being some non-kosher ingredient in the milk, in the bread or in the oil. Not at all. There, it's clear that it was for a different reason, namely the reason of erecting a barrier between Jews and non-Jews, erecting a social barrier which would keep the Jews separate from the non-Jews. This is also the reason for certain other gezerot, certain other decrees of the Chachamim. At that time, and this is also true today, in certain aspects of our life today, it is necessary to be aware of the necessity for Jews to see themselves as separate and different, because that's who we are, and everything about us is different and unique, and we have to maintain that uniqueness and that special, untainted reality of our existence. The real very real possibility of intermarriage, of assimilation, is what the Chachamim were trying to fight even way back then. This is not a new issue. Assimilation, intermarriage are not new phenomena. There were many Jews, there were many non-Jews rather, living in Eretz Yisrael at that time, 2,000 years ago and 1,500 years ago. Not only outside Israel, but also in Israel, there were many non-Jews. The reality and the possibility of meeting someone and marrying that person was a very real possibility. And therefore, certain things were stated entirely for that reason. This is what's known by the Chachamim in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, as Mishum Hatanuth. In other words, the possibility, the suspicion, or the hashash of social interaction, meeting people, getting to know them, going to their house all the time to buy bread from them and things of this nature, and eventually striking up some kind of a relationship which could lead to and eventually even to intermarriage. This is true of things like bread and oil, as discussed in the Mishnah. With regards to milk, this is not the case. The entire and the sole reason for discussing milk in the Mishnah was because of the hashash, the possibility of the admixture of milk which is from a non-kosher animal with milk that is from an animal that we are allowed to eat, and therefore also we are allowed to consume the milk of such an animal. This is very clear from the Sugyot in the Gemara, and it's also very clear from the Rambam. Rambam in Ilchot Ma'achalot Asurot in the 3rd chapter discusses this issue of milked by a non-Jew, and the entire discussion there is exactly that, speaking about the fact that which comes from a non-kosher animal has the same status as the animal itself. So the milk from a non-kosher animal is also not kosher. There is no mention there in the Rambam in that chapter at all of anything to do with intermarriage, assimilation, keeping a certain separation in existence between Jews and non-Jews. Whereas in the last chapter of Ilchot Ma'achalot HaSarot, chapter 17, there the Rambam mentions other items such as bread and oil, etc., that we mentioned, that were made forbidden by the Chachamim precisely for the reason of preventing assimilation. It's also true that in the fullness of time, due to the great difficulty of maintaining these halachot, living according to these halachot with regards to bread and oil, that it became eventually the practice to waive these decrees, and at least in situations where bread baked by a Jewish baker was not available, because bread is, after all, the staff of life. And eventually these halachot began to be modified, and a more lenient attitude was adopted with regards to them. With regards to milk, there is no room for either leniency or stringency. There's no room for kula or humra. It is all about the reality. Is there an admixture of foreign milk in the milk that you are receiving, or is there such a possibility? Bringing this discussion up to the present day, this issue was raised already many decades ago. Hagon HaGadol Rabbeinu Moshe Feinstein Zitzar was asked about this in the United States in 1954, and he writes about this, 3 teshuvot, 3 responsa, in Igroth Moshe. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein first of all explains that in many areas of the Torah, of halakha, even when we have not seen something with our own eyes, but clear knowledge of something being the case, in other words, where the assumption is essentially inexorable, and there is no reasonable doubt at all that the case is such, that is considered certain knowledge. And this is not only with regards to the matter of milk, for example, as we're discussing here. This is also true for many more, even more serious issues, such as knowing that, for example, a married person committed adultery. We do not have to see, according to halakha, the actual act of sexual intercourse between this person who is married, let's say a married woman, and another man who is not her husband. The fact that we see them together acting in such a manner as such people do, and we see them enter, shall we say, a hotel room in the evening and emerge in the morning, etc., this is sufficient proof, and a person is even hayav mithar, can even be executed based on such evidence, such knowledge, according to the Torah. Therefore, Rav Moshe Feinstein explains that seeing that nowadays, certainly in Western countries where there is rule of law, there are regulations which are enforced, and if the producer in question acts not in accordance with those laws, he is very likely to be caught, because there is government supervision, there are inspections, health department, etc. He will be found out, he will be punished, he will be fined, possibly his license will be taken away, his business will be shut down. Therefore, on the basis of all these facts, we can be quite certain, even though we do not see with our own eyes exactly what milk goes into the carton, from what animal the milk in the carton comes from, or if there was an admixture. This level of knowledge, of certainty, is sufficient. It's in fact more than sufficient. On this basis, Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote that there is a very solid halachic basis to therefore claim that in countries where such rules and regulations are in place are enforced, where there are inspections, there is supervision, and there is punishment, and there are ramifications if a company were to act not in accordance with these laws and regulations. In such places, we can consider the milk to be, which is labeled as coming from a cow, shall we say, which is the case in most, if not all, Western countries as a rule, unless it's labeled otherwise. We can assume with certainty that this milk is from that source, from that kosher source, and therefore it does not require kashrut supervision. In other words, we do not need a mashgiach, a person, a Jew, a religious Jew, to be present and to actually watch over the process of milking, which of course, by the way, raises the price of such milk. There is such milk available in different parts of the world, called Halev Yisrael, that is to say literally the milk of Jews, that was watched and supervised by a Jew. In many places such milk is available, but it is much more expensive. And this is a very reasonable and very weighty consideration, the extra cost involved. It is expensive enough and difficult enough for many Torah Jews to live a Jewish lifestyle, a Torah lifestyle, in many parts of the world, including North America, where the price of kosher food is often very expensive, the price of Jewish education is often exorbitant. And any extra expense is definitely a very weighty matter, a consideration to be taken very seriously. Even beyond this, the fact that in many cases a person, a Torah Jew, may live in an area where no other milk products really are available, only the regular standard non-Jewish source milk products are available. If, in other words, if a person doesn't happen to live in a large, well-organized Jewish community where such milk products might be available, Jewish supervised milk products, then essentially we're telling such a person that they cannot drink milk, they cannot have cottage cheese, they cannot have yogurt, etc., assuming of course that any other ingredients that may exist in any given product are all kosher. We are essentially making all form of dairy products unavailable, and this is a very very difficult thing to state when the halakha does not require such a thing, as Rav Moshe Feinstein mentions. And therefore Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote way back then in the 1950s, and things have not changed of course since then, that it is entirely correct and permissible to rely on this reality of certain or statistically near certain knowledge that the milk is of a particular source, from a kosher source, this is sufficient, and the need for kosher supervision is therefore not actually essential at all. Now, some people might say, well, perhaps in the time of Moshe Feinstein, horse milk and camel milk, for example, were not available in the United States, and therefore he wrote and gave that psak halacha. But today this is not the case. Today one can obtain, at least in certain places, such milk from horses, camels, etc., and therefore perhaps this psak halacha is no longer relevant. In response to this, I would say the following. It is true that in very specific places, in very specific stores, it might be possible to purchase such kinds of milk. But first of all, this is not a common reality. These are specialist items sold in special stores, health food stores perhaps, not places frequented by the general public. The amount of these milks in the marketplace is very, very small, minute. But more importantly, these other types of milk, shall we say horse milk or camel milk, are very, very expensive compared to cow milk. Cow milk is relatively cheap for all kinds of reasons to do with the modern production of milk and dairy cows and how much milk they produce, and the way the industrialized dairy farming is done nowadays. The price of milk is relatively very cheap, whereas horse milk, camel milk, etc. are very, very expensive. It makes absolutely no sense to claim that a company or even an individual farmer, shall we say, would add an expensive product such as horse milk to other milk when he has no reason to do so from an economic standpoint. And the Rambam writes this explicitly at the end of Yichot Ma'achalot Asuroth, chapter 17, Perek Yud Halacha Kaf Waw. Rambam writes, Kazeh morim b'chol davar shehoshashim lo shema erevu bo hagoyim davar asur. This is how we approach any such issue where the reason for the possible prohibition of eating or consuming a certain thing is due to the hashash, the possibility that the non-Jew added some other substance into the substance which is permitted. It is not reasonable at all to assume, says the Rambam, that a person would add something which is expensive, which he could get much more money for, into something which is cheap. A person would not add horse milk into cow milk, because he's losing economically. Sharei mafsid, says the Rambam. Aval ma'arev hazol bayakar. What a person might do is to add that which is cheap into something which is more expensive, hoping that he'll get away with it, or to top up the bucket, as we said before. This also has to do with the realities, as we discussed before. In ancient times, a person may well have had a few cows, he may have had a couple of dozen sheep. He also very likely had, a non-Jew would have had perhaps a pig or two or three, and a horse or a donkey on his property. And it was easy for him to turn to these sources to make up some shortfall or to solve a problem that he had at that moment in supplying the milk that he was required to supply. This is not the case at all nowadays, where in all modern countries dairy farming is a huge industry and is mechanized. The system works in a very, very specific and orderly fashion. It would be quite impossible, even if they wanted to introduce milk from a horse into a production line set up to deal with cows. The whole thing would simply not work, and there would be no reason to do so, and it would not be at all convenient. It would be a tremendous hassle for the company in question, shall we say, to try and introduce some horses into the production line, which is set up in a very specific way to deal with cows. It would be entirely impractical. Therefore, Rav Moshe Feinstein's conclusion I find very convincing and entirely sufficient to state categorically that it is mutar to eat, to drink milk and to eat milk products such as cream cheese, cottage cheese, and yogurts, assuming that if we're talking about plain yogurt, shall we say, without other additives or flavorings or what have you, because in that case, if there are such things, one has to know about the kashrut, the different various kashrut issues that may exist with other substances. In such cases, it is entirely mutar. I should stress that everything that we've said here does not relate to yellow cheese, which is a different discussion, which has to be discussed separately and explained separately, because this is a very different issue. Everything that we're saying here relates to milk and milk products such as yogurts and cream cheese, cottage cheese, as we explained.
Is it preferable, nevertheless, to refrain from eating such products which do not have kashrut supervision?
It is true that Hagaon Rabbeinu Moshe Feinstein Zitzal writes in his teshuvot on this matter, after explaining very convincingly that it is entirely mutar to consume regular milk available in supermarkets or stores. Nevertheless, he does add that for those who wish to be particularly pedantic about their halachic observance, what is referred to as a ba'al nefesh, he said it's a good idea. It is a kind of midat hasidut that is commendable to nevertheless refrain from consuming such milk and to go search for and find that kind of milk which was supervised by Jews from the moment of milking and throughout the entire process. With regards to this last point, I must state that I am not convinced by the correctness of this position of Rav Feinstein Zitzal. Because by saying such a thing, we are, even though we just mentioned that it's entirely mutar according to halacha, we are nevertheless providing a reason, an incentive, as it were, for some people who wish to see themselves as living up to living a halachic lifestyle and living up to all halachic standards to the letter. We are providing such people with a reason to nevertheless go out of their way and search out for those kinds of products that were supervised by Jews, Halev Yisrael. And again, I am concerned about the extra expense that this entails. Universally, it is always more expensive. That is one very serious consideration in my view. In other words, it seems to me, people should not be made to feel that even though it's mutar, it's better not to do so. Because this essentially is pushing them into a corner if they are particularly God-fearing people with a lot of yirat shamayim and a true, sincere desire to be halachically observant Jews in all respects. This is, as it were, pushing them into a corner and almost forcing them to act as if the other kind of milk, for example, was not kosher, and to therefore put out a lot more money. This is one point. Another point is that many people, many Jews, Torah-observant Jews, find themselves in places, in communities, either where they live as a matter of course, on a daily basis, or on business trips that they must undertake, or on vacations, or when traveling for whatever reason. Many Jews find themselves in places, in situations, where there is no other option. And there, a Jew may abstain from eating certain products, even though there's not much else to be had, because of this stringency. Particularly people who live in areas where Halev Yisrael is not available, simply not available, then this is really a very difficult load to bear, very constricting and I would think unreasonable humrah to suggest to people that it is desirable to adopt. And therefore, seeing that the halakha is absolutely clear that our certain knowledge that the milk is as labeled, that the milk is entirely kasher because it comes from an animal that is kasher, and there is absolutely no reason to think otherwise, and that this is halachically considered to be as good as real testimony, that a person actually saw what happened. This is the halakha, as Rav Moshe Feinstein points out, in many areas of the Torah. This is the halachic concept of anan sahadeh, that even though we haven't seen something, or we can't state it as a conclusive fact because we weren't present, but it's well known and it's obvious to all that this is how such a thing is, and we rely on this kind of halachic assumption based on certainty or something very near certainty in many areas of the Torah. Therefore, I do not consider it correct to tell people that it is nevertheless preferable to go out of your way and consume only Halev Yisrael. In conclusion, I would add that, in my view, we should not ever make a point of doing something which is clearly unnecessary or superfluous according to halakha. First of all, things which are unnecessary or superfluous are not only unnecessary very often, and sometimes, without people realizing it, they also can backfire and have some negative ramification or impact. And we have the well-known statement of the Talmud Yerushalmi, Kol patur min hadavar v'osehu nikra hediot. He who is exempt from doing something and nevertheless does it is considered a hediot. Hediot means a simple, unschooled, uneducated person who doesn't really understand much about what he's doing. To go ahead and make an issue of something which is clearly a non-issue, and this is something which perhaps applies not only to this issue, this question of milk products, but also to many other areas of halakha, to raise up such standards, such halachic standards as it were, which are not at all based on any halachic reality, where there is clearly no gain at all to be had by being mahmir, by being more stringent, by disallowing something which is allowed. This, as a rule of thumb, in my view, is a mistaken halachic approach.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.